He called her too plain in front of everyone, glass in hand, laughter echoing under crystal chandeliers, and across the ballroom his stunning fiancée smirked, thinking the story was already over. But near the entrance a woman stood still, unnoticed, watching him like a memory he had tried to erase, until the host stepped onto the stage and the music faded. Tonight's entire gala exists because of one person. The voice rang out, and Ethan barely listened, until the name hit the air, Clara Bennett. And suddenly the room shifted, heads turned, silence spread, and the woman he once dismissed began walking toward the spotlight. And this time, she owned everything he thought he did. He called her forgettable, right before she became the only name that mattered. The chandeliers above the ballroom glowed like molten gold, casting soft light over tailored tuxedos, silk gowns, and the quiet, practiced laughter of people who measured worth in millions. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, one hand wrapped around a crystal glass, the other resting casually at the waist of his fiancée, a woman who shimmered in silver and confidence. The kind of presence that demanded attention without asking, and Ethan thrived in that attention, feeding on it, shaping it, owning it, because this world, the polished marble floors, the curated conversations, the invisible hierarchy, had always been his stage, and tonight was no different, except for the name that slipped into the conversation like a ghost he thought he had buried, Clara Bennett. And the moment it was spoken, something in the air shifted, subtle but sharp, like a note just slightly out of tune, and Ethan's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Clara, he echoed, lightly, as if the name itself amused him, as if it belonged to a story too small to matter here. She was never made for places like this. He added, his tone smooth, dismissive, effortless, the kind of cruelty that didn't need volume to cut deep, and a few people nearby exchanged glances, polite smiles stretching thin across their faces, unsure whether to laugh or look away. But his fiancée leaned in, her laughter soft and approving, reinforcing the narrative he had built that Clara had been. A mistake, a mismatch, something plain in a world that demanded spectacle. And across the room, near the tall glass doors where the city lights flickered like distant stars, a woman stood quietly, her silhouette framed by the reflection of Manhattan's skyline, unnoticed, unannounced, as if she existed just outside the boundaries of their attention. Her dress simple, elegant, the deep shade of midnight absorbing the light rather than chasing it. And she didn't move forward, didn't interrupt, didn't claim space the way the others did. She simply watched, her gaze steady, unreadable, as if she were measuring something no one else could see. And for a moment, a server passed by her and nodded with a respect that didn't belong to a stranger. But the gesture was small, almost invisible, swallowed by the hum of conversation and the clink of glass against glass. And back at the center of the room, Ethan lifted his drink slightly, continuing his story as though it deserved an audience. She was fine, he said, choosing the word with deliberate care. Just too plain for this life. And the word hung there, plain, heavy, final, as if it were a verdict rather than an opinion. And somewhere behind him, the music softened, the kind of subtle shift that signaled something important was about to happen, though most people didn't notice, not yet, and the woman by the door finally moved just one step forward, her heels quiet against the polished floor, her presence still barely a ripple in the room, but something about the way she walked, unhurried, certain, began to draw the eye, not loudly, not all at once, but like gravity slowly asserting itself. And as the host approached the stage, adjusting the microphone, the conversations dimmed just enough to let anticipation seep in. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice began, warm and practiced. Tonight would not exist without one extraordinary individual. And Ethan barely glanced toward the stage, still caught in the comfort of his own narrative, unaware that across the room, the woman he had just reduced to a memory was no longer standing in the shadows. And for the first time that evening, the room was about to learn her name all over again. The applause came too early, too polite, the kind that filled space without understanding it, and Ethan barely turned his head as the host continued speaking, his attention still anchored in the comfort of his own voice, but something about the shift in the room began to press against him. Subtle at first, like a change in temperature you cannot quite explain, and across the ballroom, Clara moved forward, each step measured, unhurried, her heels tracing a quiet rhythm against the marble floor that somehow cut through the noise more effectively than any announcement. And as she walked, the staff noticed her first, not the guests, the staff whose job it was to understand hierarchy without being told, their posture straightening, their eyes lowering in quiet acknowledgement. And it was in those small, nearly invisible gestures that the truth began to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Clara did not rush to the spotlight. She let it come to her, the light catching the edge of her profile, revealing a face that had not changed in the ways Ethan once criticized, but had sharpened in ways he could not recognize, her expression calm, composed, untouched by the need for approval that had once defined her in his presence. And for a moment, as she passed a mirrored column, her reflection met her eyes, and in that brief glance, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only a quiet confirmation of something she had built far away from rooms like this, rooms that used to make her feel small, and the memory surfaced not as pain, but as distance, a different life, a different version of herself standing beside Ethan in these same circles, smiling when spoken to, silent when dismissed, adjusting her presence to fit the edges of his world. And she remembered the nights when she had stood just behind him, listening to conversations she was never invited into, feeling the weight of being seen but not recognized, valued, but never truly known, and the word he used tonight, plain, echoed faintly, but it did not land the same way anymore. It did not carry power. It simply sounded outdated, like something that no longer belonged to her. And as the host's voice grew more animated, describing the vision, the generosity, the influence behind the evening, a ripple of curiosity began to move through the guests, heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence, the energy shifting from casual indulgence to focused attention, and Ethan finally looked up, not because he felt threatened, but because the room itself demanded it, his gaze following the subtle current of movement until it found her, and at first he did not react, not truly, because recognition does not always arrive as shock. Sometimes it comes slowly, piece by piece, as the mind struggles to align what it sees with what it believes to be true, and Clara did not look like the woman he had left behind. Not in the ways that mattered here. She did not compete with the glittering gowns or the calculated charm. She did not need to, because there was something else about her now, something quieter but far more commanding. And as she stepped closer to the stage, the light settled fully on her, not as decoration, but as confirmation, and the host turned toward her with a smile that held genuine respect, not performance, not obligation, but recognition. And in that moment, the distance between who she had been and who she was now became visible to everyone in the room, even to Ethan, though he did not yet have the language for it. Only the feeling, unfamiliar and unwelcome, that something he once dismissed had returned, and it had not come back the same. The room held its breath in a way that no one could quite explain, as if the air itself had shifted to make space for something inevitable. And when the host finally turned fully toward her, the smile on his face was no longer part of the performance, but something steadier, grounded in recognition. The vision behind tonight, the force who made this entire evening possible, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with a clarity that silenced even the softest whispers, is Ms. Clara Bennett, and the name did not explode through the room. It settled, heavy and undeniable, like truth that had always been there waiting to be acknowledged. And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, no applause, no reaction, just a suspended moment where every face seemed to recalibrate. And then the shift came all at once. Heads turning, eyes widening, conversations collapsing into silence as the weight of that name found its place in the hierarchy of the room, and Ethan felt it before. He understood it, a tightening in his chest, a subtle loss of footing in a space he had always controlled, his gaze locking onto her, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the memory he had reduced to something small, something dismissible, but there was no alignment, no easy recognition. Because Clara did not carry herself like someone returning to prove a point. She carried herself like someone who no longer needed one. And as she stepped onto the stage, the light did not overpower her. It followed her, settling naturally against the quiet authority in her posture, her expression composed, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply certain. And when the first wave of applause finally broke, it was not polite or hesitant. It was immediate, genuine, rising from a place of respect rather than obligation. And Clara acknowledged it with a small nod. Nothing more, no grand gesture, no performance to match the scale of the moment, because she did not need to amplify what was already undeniable. And from where he stood, Ethan could feel the room reorient itself around her. Conversations that once orbited him, now drifting toward the stage. Attention shifting in a way that felt irreversible. And for the first time that night, his fiancée's hand at his side felt distant, irrelevant, as if the carefully constructed image he had built was no longer the center of gravity. And Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, measured, carrying easily without strain. "Thank you for being here tonight," she said, her tone steady, warm but not seeking approval. This event was never about recognition. It was about impact. And the words landed differently than the ones Ethan had used earlier. Not sharp, not dismissive, but grounded, purposeful. And as she continued, speaking briefly, efficiently, the way someone does when they understand that their presence already says enough, Ethan realized something he had not prepared for. Not shock, not regret, but clarity, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. That the version of Clara he had defined, the one he had labeled and dismissed, had never truly been the whole story. It had only been the part he was capable of seeing, and now, standing in the same room, under the same lights, the difference between who he thought she was and who she had become was no longer subtle. It was absolute, and when her speech ended, when the applause rose again, louder this time, fuller, the kind that lingers just a second longer than expected, Clara did not look toward him, did not search for his reaction, did not acknowledge the past in any visible way. She simply stepped back from the microphone, composed as ever, and in that quiet, deliberate movement, Ethan understood something far more unsettling than humiliation. He understood that whatever place he once held in her world no longer existed at all. The applause lingered just a second longer than necessary, then dissolved into the familiar hum of conversation. But the room was no longer the same room. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone could feel it even if no one said it out loud. And as Clara stepped down from the stage, people moved toward her without hesitation, not out of curiosity, but recognition. Investors, board members, names that carried weight in rooms like this. Each one waiting, not for her attention, but for a moment of it. And she greeted them with the same calm precision she had carried onto the stage. Listening more than speaking, her presence controlled, intentional, never rushed. And across the ballroom, Ethan stood still, the glass in his hand, untouched now, the condensation slipping slowly down the side, as if time had decided to make itself visible. And for the first time that night, he was not the one being approached, not the one being acknowledged, and the absence of it was louder than any. Applause, his fiancée shifting beside him, her confidence faltering just enough to be noticeable, her eyes following the same gravitational pull as everyone else in the room, and Ethan felt it then, not jealousy, not quite regret, but displacement, a quiet, unsettling awareness that the center of the room had moved, and he was no longer standing in it. And without fully deciding to, he began to walk, each step slower than the last, as if some part of him already understood that crossing that distance would not restore what had been lost. But he moved anyway, drawn not by pride, but by something far more difficult to name. And as he approached, the conversations around Clara shifted to make space, not abruptly, but naturally, the way people do when someone of importance is about to be addressed. And for a brief moment, there was an opening, a pause in the flow of voices, and Clara turned slightly, not because she sensed him, but because the rhythm of the room required it. And there, eyes met, not with the intensity of unfinished emotion, but with the clarity of two people who no longer shared the same version of the past. And Ethan spoke first, his voice lower now, stripped of the easy confidence he had worn earlier. "Clara," he said, her name sounding unfamiliar even to him, as if it belonged to someone he had not truly known, and she acknowledged him with a small, polite nod. Nothing more, no surprise, no tension, just recognition. And in that simplicity, he felt the imbalance more sharply than before. "I did not know you would be here," he added, the words falling short. The moment they left him, and Claire's expression did not change, but there was a quiet understanding behind her eyes, as if she had heard versions of that sentence before and had long since stopped needing a different one. "There are many things you did not know," she replied, her voice even, not cold, not warm, simply true, and the statement did not accuse, did not invite explanation. It simply existed, complete on its own. And for a second, Ethan searched for something to say that would bridge the distance between who they had been and who they were now. But there was nothing that fit, nothing that belonged in this version of reality. And around them, the room continued to move, conversations resuming, attention returning to Clara in quiet waves. And she turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the next person waiting, signaling without emphasis that the moment had already passed. And Ethan stood there for a fraction longer than he should have, the realization settling, not as a sudden blow, but as something slower, heavier, that whatever story he thought he could revisit, whatever version of Clara he believed still existed somewhere within reach, was no longer accessible. And as he finally stepped back, blending into the edges of a room he once commanded, the truth became unavoidable. She had not returned to prove him wrong. She had returned having outgrown the need to. The music resumed as if nothing had happened, a smooth transition back into curated elegance. But beneath it, the rhythm of the room had changed in ways that could not be undone, and Clara moved through the crowd with the same quiet certainty. No longer the woman trying to belong, but the one who defined the space without needing to announce it. Her conversations brief, but meaningful, her attention deliberate, and everywhere she went. The atmosphere followed, conversations adjusting, people leaning in just slightly more, as if proximity to her carried its own kind of value. And across the ballroom, Ethan found himself watching from a distance he had not chosen but could not seem to close, his reflection faintly visible in the tall glass panels, superimposed over the city lights beyond. And for a moment, he barely recognized the man staring back. The confidence still there, but thinner now, less certain, as if it had been built on something he could no longer access. And his fiancée spoke beside him, her voice soft but edged with something sharper, asking questions he did not fully hear, her gaze flickering toward Clara with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. But Ethan did not answer, not because he could not, but because the answers no longer felt relevant. And as the evening unfolded, the distance between him and the center of the room grew more defined, not dramatic, not obvious, just steady, like a current pulling him quietly toward the edges. And he realized then that what unsettled him was not what Clara had become, but what she no longer was. She was no longer reacting to him, no longer shaped by his opinions, no longer existing within the framework he had once controlled. And that absence, that complete independence from his narrative, was something he had never anticipated. And near the end of the evening, as the final speeches gave way to softer conversations and lingering goodbyes, Clara stepped toward the exit, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, and for a brief moment, the path ahead of her cleared without effort, people stepping aside, not out of obligation, but recognition. And just before she reached the doors, she paused, not turning back, not searching for anything behind her, but simply allowing the moment to settle, the quiet after the noise, the stillness after the shift. And outside, the city stretched wide and indifferent, its lights steady, its motion constant, a reminder that the world did not revolve around any single room, any single version of a story. And as she stepped forward, crossing that threshold without hesitation, The past remained exactly where it belonged, behind her, untouched, unchanged, and inside, Ethan stood in the same place, surrounded by the same people, the same music, the same carefully constructed world, but it no longer felt the same, because for the first time, he understood something that did not come with applause or recognition, something quieter, heavier, and far more permanent, that the woman he once called plain had not returned to be seen. She had returned as someone who no longer needed to be. The night air outside carried a different kind of silence, not empty, but expansive, the kind that did not press against her, but open around her, and Clara stepped onto the curb as the city moved in its steady rhythm. Headlights gliding past like distant constellations, the faint hum of traffic grounding the moment in something real, something untouched by the performance she had just left behind, and for the first time that evening, she exhaled fully, not from tension, but from completion, as if a chapter she had not realized was still open had finally closed on its own terms. And behind her, through the tall glass doors, the gala continued, reduced now to a distant glow, its significance shrinking with every step she took away from it, and her phone vibrated softly in her hand, a series of messages lighting up the screen, names she recognized, names she did not, invitations, congratulations, questions carefully phrased to bridge a connection that had not existed before, and she glanced at them briefly, not dismissing them, but not attaching weight to them either, because she understood something now that she had not understood before, that attention like applause was momentary, and it was not where her value lived. And a black car pulled up smoothly at the curb, the driver stepping out with quiet efficiency, opening the door without needing to ask, and Clara paused for a second before getting in, her gaze lifting once more to the skyline, the lights stretching endlessly, a reminder that the world she had built was far larger than any single room, any single opinion. And as she settled into the seat, the door closing softly behind her, the noise of the city faded into a muted backdrop, and for a moment she allowed herself to sit in the stillness, not replaying the night, not dissecting it, simply acknowledging it for what it was, a point of arrival that had taken years to reach. Years she remembered now in fragments. Late nights spent working when no one was watching, quiet decisions made without validation, the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life that had once been defined by someone else's expectations. And she thought of the version of herself who had stood in rooms like that before, adjusting her voice, her posture, her presence to fit into a narrative she did not write. And the contrast was not dramatic, not loud, but it was absolute. And back inside, Ethan lingered near the same spot, though the crowd had shifted again, conversations flowing around him without stopping. His name mentioned less frequently now, his presence acknowledged, but no longer central. And he felt the absence of something he could not reclaim, not because it had been taken, but because it had moved on without him. And as the night continued, he found himself glancing toward the doors more than once, as if expecting something, a return, a second moment, but nothing came, and the realization settled slowly, that the story he thought might have another chapter had already ended without his participation. And outside, the car moved through the city, merging seamlessly into the flow of lights and motion, carrying Clara forward into a life that no longer required explanation, no longer needed to prove its worth to anyone who had once doubted it. And as the skyline shifted in the window beside her, she rested her hand lightly against the glass, not as a gesture of longing, but of presence, grounded in where she was, in what she had built, and in the quiet understanding that the most powerful moments were not the ones where the world finally saw you, but the ones where you realized you no longer needed it to. The car slowed as it turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into something softer, more distant, and Clara watched the reflections shift across the window, buildings giving way to longer stretches of shadow and light, the kind of transition that marked not just distance, but separation. And she did not check her phone again, though it continued to light up beside her, because she already knew what it would say. Variations of the same realization spreading through the same circles that once overlooked her, and she felt no urgency to respond, No pull to re-enter conversations that only now found her relevant, because the life she had built had never depended on their attention in the first place. And when the car finally came to a stop in front of a quiet, understated building, there was no crowd, no cameras, no performance waiting for her arrival. Just a doorman who greeted her with a simple nod. Familiar, consistent, unchanged. And as she stepped out, the air felt different here, steadier, untouched by the curated energy of the gala, and she moved inside without pause, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor of the lobby, a sound that belonged to her now, not because it demanded notice, but because it carried certainty. And upstairs, the space that greeted her was calm, deliberate, every detail chosen not for impression, but for meaning, and she set her phone down without checking it again, slipping out of her heels and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city from a distance that felt earned, not borrowed. And for a moment, she simply stood there, her reflection faint against the glass, not searching for anything, just present, and the memories came. Then, not as interruptions, but as quiet acknowledgments of how far she had come. The early days after she left Ethan, when the silence had felt heavier than any crowd, when her name carried no weight, when even simple decisions felt uncertain because they were no longer filtered through someone else's approval. And she remembered the way she used to hesitate before speaking, before choosing, before stepping forward, as if permission was something she needed to earn, and the contrast was not dramatic now. It was settled, integrated, a part of her that no longer required reflection to be understood. And across the city, in a room still filled with light and voices, Ethan finally left the gala later than he intended, not because he had more to say, but because he had nowhere else to go that would make the shift feel less real. And as he stepped outside, the same city that had once felt like an extension of his influence now felt indifferent, unchanged by his presence. And he stood there for a moment, looking up at the skyline as if searching for something familiar within it. But the familiarity did not return, because the difference was not in the city, it was in what he could no longer control within it. And when he finally got in his car, the silence inside felt different than before, not empty, but reflective, the kind that does not offer distraction, only clarity. And back at her apartment, Clara moved away from the window, the night settling around her in a way that felt complete rather than unfinished, and she did not think about what might happen next, did not anticipate reactions or consequences, because for the first time, none of that defined the direction of her life. And as she turned off the lights, leaving only the city's glow filtering in, there was no sense of anticipation, no need for resolution. Only the quiet certainty that what had once been a defining chapter had become something far smaller, a distant point in a story that had continued without it. And somewhere across that same city, Ethan began to understand that the absence he felt was not temporary, not something that would shift with time or effort, but something permanent, the kind that comes when a door does not close loudly, but simply ceases to exist. Morning arrived without ceremony. A pale wash of light stretching across the city as it always did, indifferent to what had shifted the night before, and Clara woke not with urgency, but with a steady awareness of the day ahead, the kind that did not demand attention but carried purpose. And as she moved through her apartment, the quiet felt natural, not empty, each action deliberate, grounded, the routine she had built over time unfolding without interruption. And when she finally reached her phone, the screen lit up again with the remnants of last night's ripple. Messages stacked, invitations extended, opportunities framed in polished language that tried to sound effortless. But she read them differently now, not as validation, not as arrival, but as alignment, the natural result of work that had long existed without an audience. And she responded to a few, briefly, efficiently, not out of obligation, but intention. Choosing where her time would go rather than reacting to where it was being pulled. And somewhere across the city, Ethan sat at his kitchen counter, the morning light too sharp, too honest, cutting through the space in a way that made everything feel more exposed than usual, and his phone buzzed as well, but the tone was different, Messages laced with curiosity, subtle shifts in language that he recognized but could not fully control, questions about Clara, about her involvement, about things he should have known but did not, and he answered some, ignored others, the balance unfamiliar, the control he once held slipping in ways that did not announce themselves, but accumulated quietly. And as the day unfolded, the contrast between their worlds became clearer, not through dramatic change, but through direction. Clara moved forward, meetings scheduled, decisions made, conversations that expanded rather than questioned, her presence consistent, her influence growing not because she demanded it, but because it had already been established long before anyone noticed. And Ethan found himself revisiting fragments of the past, not out of nostalgia, but confusion, searching for the moment where he had misread her, where he had decided she was something less than what she was becoming. And the answer did not come as a single event, but as a series of smaller ones, overlooked details, quiet strengths he had dismissed, choices she had made without needing his approval. And the realization settled slowly, that he had not just underestimated her, he had failed to see her entirely. And later that afternoon, as Clara stepped into a conference room overlooking the river, the city stretching wide beneath the glass, she paused for a moment before taking her seat, not to gather confidence, but to acknowledge the path that had brought her there, the years that had built this moment without spectacle. And as the meeting began, her voice carried the same clarity it had the night before, calm, precise, not seeking agreement, but creating it. And back in his office, Ethan stood by his window, looking out at the same skyline from a different angle, the distance between them no longer measured in miles, but in understanding, and for the first time, the thought did not feel temporary, did not suggest correction or recovery. It simply existed, complete, undeniable, that the version of her he had once defined had never been the limit of who she was, and now, standing on opposite sides of a city that no longer connected them in the same way, he began to understand that what he had lost was not something he could win back, because it had never truly belonged to him at all. The city moved forward the way it always did, steady, indifferent, carrying thousands of stories at once without pausing for any single one. And Clara stepped out of the building just after her meeting. Ended, the late afternoon light stretching long across the pavement, softening the edges of everything it touched, and she paused for a brief moment at the top of the steps, not to reflect, but to recalibrate. The transition from one space to another seamless, controlled, and as she descended, a familiar voice called her name, not loudly, but with enough certainty to reach her without effort, and she turned, not startled, not hesitant, simply present, and saw Daniel Hayes approaching. His stride relaxed, his expression composed in a way that suggested both confidence and restraint, a man who understood the value of timing. And as he reached her, there was no rush to fill the silence, only a brief exchange of acknowledgement, the kind that carried history without needing to explain it. "I watched the coverage," he said after a moment, his tone measured, not impressed, not surprised, simply aware. And Clara met his gaze with the same calm she had carried through the day. "It was not for them," she replied, her words precise, and Daniel gave a small nod, as if that answer had been expected, as if it confirmed something he had already understood about her long before anyone else had. And together they walked a few steps along the sidewalk, the rhythm of the city folding around them, people passing without interruption, the moment contained but not isolated, and across town. Ethan sat in a meeting that felt longer than it was, the conversation circling numbers and projections that had once held his full attention, but now seemed slightly out of reach, his focus drifting in ways he could not control. And when Clara's name surfaced again, this time not in speculation, but in relevance, tied to partnerships, to influence, to decisions that extended beyond his immediate reach, he felt the shift more sharply, not as an attack, but as a realignment, the kind that did not ask for permission. And back on the street, Daniel glanced toward Clara, his expression thoughtful. "You could have made it louder," he said, not as a suggestion, but as an observation, and Clara allowed a faint smile to touch her expression, subtle, almost imperceptible. "Loud does not last," she answered, her voice steady, and the simplicity of it settled between them, not as a conclusion, but as a principle, something that had shaped every step she had taken to reach this point. And Daniel did not argue, did not add to it, because he recognized the weight behind the words, the years they carried. And as they reached the corner, the light shifted, the city continuing its endless movement around them. Clara paused again, not out of uncertainty, but intention, her gaze lifting briefly toward the skyline before returning to the present. And in that moment, there was no trace of the past version of her that once questioned her place in spaces like this. No hesitation, no need to measure herself against anyone else's expectations, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already done the work long before anyone thought to notice. And across the city, as Ethan stood by the window once more, the realization settled deeper, no longer sharp, no longer unfamiliar, but steady, that the distance between them was not something that could be crossed with words or time, because it was not built from circumstance. It was built from growth, from choices, made independently, from a life that had expanded beyond the boundaries he once defined. And as the evening approached again, bringing with it the same lights, the same movement, the same city that never paused, both of them stood within it, not connected by the past, but separated by something far more enduring, the simple, undeniable truth that she had moved forward and she had not needed him to do it. The evening returned with a familiar glow, the city once again wrapped in amber light and quiet ambition. But this time, Clara did not step into a room to be seen. She stepped into one to decide, and the private dining space overlooking the river was smaller, more contained, yet far more significant than the ballroom from the night before, because here, influence was not performed, it was negotiated. And as she entered, the conversation paused, not out of curiosity, but recognition, the kind that had already settled into place. And Daniel stood as she approached, not as a gesture of formality, but alignment, a silent acknowledgement of the role she now held. And around the table, familiar names turned toward her, people who once would have overlooked her now recalibrating their attention with careful precision. And Clara took her seat without hesitation, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. And when the discussion resumed, it shifted almost immediately toward her. Not forced, not exaggerated, but natural, as if the direction had always been meant to move this way. And she listened first, allowing the conversation to unfold, absorbing the structure, the intentions, the subtle tensions beneath the surface. And when she spoke, it was not to dominate, but to define, her voice steady, measured, carrying clarity rather than volume. And each word seemed to settle into place with quiet authority, shaping the direction of the discussion without needing to push it. And across the table, Daniel watched without interruption, his gaze thoughtful, not surprised because this was not new to him. It was simply visible now in a way it had not been before. And as the meeting progressed, decisions began to align, not around personalities, but around certainty. And Clara felt it, not as power, but as balance, the kind she had spent years building in spaces where no one had been watching. And across the city, Ethan sat alone in his office long after the workday had ended. The lights dimmed, the skyline stretching beyond the glass in quiet contrast to the noise still echoing in his mind. And on his desk, a report lay open, its contents clear, undeniable, outlining a partnership he had once assumed would fall within his reach, now redirected, not taken, not contested, but simply moved. And as he read through it again, slower this time, the details settled into something more permanent. The realization no longer sharp, no longer surprising, but complete. And, for a moment, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the city as if searching for something familiar within it. But the familiarity did not return because the shift was not external. It was structural, embedded in decisions he had not been part of, in conversations he had not been invited to. And back at the table, as the meeting came to a close, the tone remained steady, no celebration, no dramatic conclusion, just a series of decisions finalized with quiet confidence. And Clara stood with the others, exchanging brief acknowledgments, her presence consistent from beginning to end. And as she stepped away from the table, Daniel moved beside her, his voice low, almost reflective. "You changed the direction without forcing it," he said, and Clara glanced at him, her expression calm, her answer simple. "It was already moving," she replied, and the statement held no need for validation, no need for agreement. It simply existed as truth, and as she left the room, the city awaited again, unchanged yet entirely different, and somewhere across that same skyline, Ethan remained seated in the quiet of his office, the realization settling into something he could no longer ignore, that the world he once believed he controlled had not been taken from him. It had continued without him. The city did not pause for reflection, but Clara did, just for a moment, as she stepped out onto the quiet terrace attached to the dining room. The night air cooler now, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic and the steady glow of the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the river, and she rested her hands lightly against the railing, not as someone searching for clarity, but as someone acknowledging it, the kind that arrives without announcement, built over time rather than granted in a single moment. And behind her, through the glass, the room continued, voices low, controlled, decisions already set into motion, and none of it required her presence anymore, because she had already done what she came to do. And as she stood there, the memory of the Gala surfaced again, not as something unresolved, but as something complete, a moment that no longer held weight, only context. And she realized then that the significance of that night had never been about him. It had been about her, about the quiet confirmation that she had crossed a threshold long before anyone else noticed. And inside, Daniel stepped onto the terrace beside her, his presence steady, unintrusive, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but understood. "You did not need to come tonight," he said finally, his voice low, reflective, and Clara turned slightly, her expression calm. "I know," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her answer, no lingering attachment to the idea that she had something to prove. And Daniel studied her for a brief second, as if measuring something beyond words, then gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged not just a response, but the path behind it. And across the city, in an office that had grown too quiet, Ethan remained seated, the report still open in front of him, though he was no longer reading it, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass, the lights of the skyline reflecting faintly in his eyes. And for the first time, the silence around him did not feel temporary, did not suggest interruption. It felt settled, like something that had arrived to stay. And he thought of the conversation at the gala, the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with regret, but with something far more distant, something final. And the realization that followed was not sharp, not immediate, but slow and complete, that there had been a moment, somewhere in the past, where things might have been different, where he might have seen her clearly, might have understood the depth behind what he dismissed, but that moment had passed without him recognizing it. And now, it no longer existed as a possibility. And back on the terrace, Clara straightened slightly, her gaze lifting once more to the skyline before she stepped away from the railing. Not because she was leaving something behind, but because there was nothing left to hold on to there. And as she moved back inside, the transition was seamless, her presence re-entering the room without disruption, because it no longer needed to be announced. And Daniel followed a step behind, the two of them moving forward into the next phase of conversation that had already shifted direction. And across the city, Ethan finally stood, the chair sliding back with a quiet sound that seemed louder than it was. And he reached for his jacket, not with urgency, not with purpose, but with the understanding that remaining there would not change anything. And as he turned off the lights and stepped out of the office, the hallway stretched ahead of him, empty, silent, and for the first time, he did not look back, because there was nothing behind him that could alter what had already become clear, that whatever place he once held in her life had not been taken, had not been replaced, it had simply ceased to matter. The night settled into something quieter, The kind of stillness that does not demand attention, but deepens everything it touches, and Clara moved through it with the same steady rhythm she had carried all day, her pace unhurried, her mind clear, not because there was nothing left to consider, but because there was nothing left to question, and as she returned home, the city lights reflecting softly against the glass, she paused only briefly before stepping inside, the space welcoming her not as an escape, but as a continuation of a life she had built, and she placed her keys down with a quiet certainty, the small sound grounding the moment in something real, something entirely her own, and for a second, she allowed the silence to settle around her, not heavy, not empty, but complete, and across the city. Ethan stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air cooler now, carrying the faint echo of everything he had left behind in that office. And he stood there for a moment, looking up at the skyline, the same skyline he had once associated with progress, with control, with direction, and yet tonight it felt different, not because it had changed, but because his place within it had shifted in a way he could no longer ignore, and the realization was not sharp anymore. Not something that surprised him, it was steady now, integrated, something he could feel in a way conversations had moved without him, in the way decisions had been made without his input, in the way her name had begun to carry weight in spaces where it once dominated, and he understood then that this was not a temporary imbalance, not something he could correct with effort or intention. It was something that had already settled into place, and back in her apartment, Clara moved toward the window once more, the city stretching out before her, vast, alive, and entirely separate from the past that no longer held her, and she rested her hand lightly against the glass, not searching for reflection, but acknowledging distance, the kind that is not measured in miles, but in growth, and she thought of the version of herself who once stood in rooms waiting to be noticed, waiting to be understood, waiting for someone else to define her worth. And the contrast was not dramatic now. It was quiet, complete, something that no longer required comparison to be meaningful. And as she stepped away from the window, the decision was not conscious, not deliberate. It simply happened, the past releasing its final hold without resistance. And across the city, Ethan finally began to walk, not toward anything in particular, but away from something he could no longer return to, his steps slower at first, then steady, the movement itself grounding him in a way that thought no longer could. And as he passed through the streets, the noise of the city surrounding him, he realized that what unsettled him most was not that she had changed. It was that she had done so without needing him to witness it, without needing him to validate it. And that absence, that complete independence from his perception, was something he could not undo. And back in her space, Clara turned off the last light, leaving only the glow of the city filtering in, soft, constant. And as she moved further into the quiet of the night, there was no anticipation, no lingering tension, only the steady awareness that what had once defined her had now become something else entirely, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into something that no longer held power over her. And somewhere across that same city, Ethan continued walking, the distance between them no longer something that could be closed, not because it was too far, but because it no longer existed as something meant to be crossed. And in that realization, something settled in a place for both of them, not as a shared moment, but as separate truths, equally final, equally complete, that the story they once shared had not ended in conflict or resolution, but in something far quieter, far more permanent. It had simply outgrown itself.